thank you for coming. Here at Auckland Museum, we like to think we are aware of some, if not most, hopefully all, of the hazards we encounter on a daily basis with the collection objects. For splashes, we wear goggles and Tyvek suits. For gases, we have gas masks. We always wear steel cap shoes. And I'm wearing a disposable Tyvek cover over my shoes, so should I step in anything that would be nasty to spread around the place, I can contain that in one area. Val is going to tell us about some of the dangers we might encounter in the collection.
Okay, so just off the top of my head, I sort of thought, what are the toxic and hazardous things I've met in museum collections? And this is the list I came up of everything that I have encountered in museum collections so far, and I'm sure, and I've encountered it all here in Auckland Museum, but I'm sure we can add to the list, but I've met heavy metals and acids and radioactive materials and drugs and pharmaceuticals in medical collections, asbestos. At this stage of the game, museums are one of the last places where you can find things with asbestos. They've been cleared out of pretty much everything else. Poison arrows, biotoxins such as mold. When it comes to archaeological materials, that's interesting. Not only do you have to keep your tetanus shots up to date for dealing with the rusty metals, but oftentimes archaeological sites, there's been plagues and diseases at the time that you're digging through, and there are records of bacteria still being viable after over 100 years from archaeological digs. So you do have to think about this when you're dealing with them. And then, of course, in conservation, we have all the toxic chemicals. And now, I'm going to hand things over to my delightful co-host, Siren, who is as mad as a hatter.
Back in the day, a dapper gentleman's ensemble was not complete without a dashing felted hat. Here in New Zealand, we're used to felt being made from wool, because that's what we have a bounty of in New Zealand. But back in the day, in France, where the felting process originated, it was the fur of rabbits and rats and cute little furry animals that formed the basis for felt making. The felt hat industry can be traced back to the mid-17th century in France and was probably introduced to England in 1830. It also flourished in Canada and America, where in Danbury, Connecticut, there were 56 factories who, in the industry boom of the 1880s, created 5 million hats per year, which was a pretty high consumption of hats for that era. In America and Canada, the fur of choice to make a dashing hat was beaver fur, because like we've got lots of sheep, they had a lot of beavers. And although he may look cuddly and soft, his fur is actually bristly and spiky. So to turn him into a hat was a somewhat complex method. So this method was what milliners of old would have called a top secret scientific trick, but is what we call today a poisonous process. The closely guarded industry secret was something that was called carroting, which was a process which unstiffened the stiff fibre of the beaver fur, made it soft and pliable so that it could mat together into a felt fabric, which could then be moulded and shaped into the form of a hat with the use of steam. The process was called carroting because the substance used was orange, and it involved bathing the animal fur in an orange-coloured solution of mercury nitrate. The secret ingredient for milliners of old was mercury. Here we have a diagram of how a hat was made. Step 1, dead beast. Step 2 and 3, pelt is denuded of its fur and sorted into qualities, and then put into the carroting bath. So all of the next steps, all the way up to here, involve steaming the felt, which anyone would realise then aerated vaporised the residue from the mercury bath. So what this meant was that in the majority of the steps to make a hat, the milliner himself was breathing in mercury, and thus the factories were simply full of toxic air. Here is a photo of a hat factory and some workers. Not surprisingly for this era, you'll notice that no one's wearing a Tyvek suit, not even any gloves. And if ever any fellows could have benefited from my outfit today, it was these guys. Because, after all, if you're working in a toxic factory and breathing in the air, who knows what might happen to you? But we know what happened to these guys, because prolonged exposure to mercury vapours, surprise, surprise, causes mercury poisoning. Victims developed uncontrollable muscle tremors, twitching limbs, and these symptoms were simply referred to as hatter's shakes. Other symptoms of mercury poisoning included distorted vision and slurred speech, sometimes referred to as a drunk hatter. Advanced cases developed hallucinations and psychotic symptoms, which is no surprise where our expression mad as a hatter comes from. It wasn't that Lewis Carroll's Mad Hatter was a crazy fashion diva with a personal relationship with a rabbit. It was just that he had been poisoned by his trade. He was literally a fashion victim. We have several felted hats in the museum's collection, all of which are safe to handle today, but they all share in common a very poisonous and tragic past. Val is going to tell us about a different object in the collection that relates to mercury.
So this is a mercury dichloroethane self-winding clock that was built by George Bolt, the pioneering New Zealand aviator, for whom George Bolt Drive down by the airport is named. If you want to take a look at it, you can see it through the Conservation Lab windows down in the atrium. So the mechanism, how it works, down here you have a globe that's half full of several kilograms of mercury, and the air above it is not air, it's dichloroethane gas. And so as the temperature rose throughout the day, the gas would expand and it would push the mercury down this tube and up this column, which would make the column heavier, so it would drop down and push on these levers to wind the mechanism. So not only do we have toxic and poisonous mercury in the clock, we also have poisonous gas, dichloroethane. And dichloroethane in the past was used as a local anesthetic. In low doses it would produce symptoms of drunkenness, but in high doses it was lethal. Now, in addition to that, we also have lead in this clock, because originally there was a lead weight hanging from this cable here that was composed of lead shot in a glass container. However, at some point in time in the past, there was a leak and the inside of the clock got wet and the lead corroded. And as it corroded, it expanded and shattered the glass, and it all fell down here, fortunately not smashing the mercury reservoir. But you can see all the powdered white lead here and the white corroded lead shot at the bottom. Okay. So I thought I'd introduce you to some of the interesting properties of mercury. Not only is it one of only 2 elements on the periodic table that is liquid at room temperature and pressure, but because it's a liquid, it has a vapor pressure. Its density is 13 times that of water, which means that it's more dense than most metals. So if you take a coin and put it in a bucket full of mercury, it will float on top, as in this picture. mercury is a metal, so it has all the properties of a metal. It's shiny and metallic looking, and it conducts heat and electricity. But it also has interesting surface tension properties, which you can see here. At the edge, the edge of the liquid curves down where it meets the glass, whereas if this was a glass of water, it would curve up. Now this means that when you accidentally spill mercury, it beads up into nice little balls that act almost like they're frictionless and bounce all over the place, which makes it very difficult to clean up. And of course, as Siren mentioned, it is highly toxic, and it has a vapor pressure because it's a liquid, which means even just sitting in the same room as it, you're inhaling small quantities of it. So at this point in time, I thought I'd introduce you to, or reintroduce you to the periodic table. I'm sure you've met it at some point in time in the past. But everything in the universe is made from these elements. That's all the elements there are. Well, there's a few extra down here at the bottom. These ones aren't naturally occurring. They only occur in physicists' labs for a few nanoseconds at a time. But anyhow, interesting things about the periodic table. Well, if we look at how it's set up, in each column, the chemicals have similar chemical properties. So you have the alkali metals over here. Over here you have the noble gases. They're all gases. Down here you have copper, silver, gold, all in the same column. So chemicals in the same column have similar chemistries. I was going to say, as you know, everything in the universe is made up of these elements, and that includes you, your body, the air you're breathing, and the chair you're sitting on. So, yeah, everything you can touch is made up of these things. If you're thinking of living organisms like ourselves, the elements that make us up are all near the top. Carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, and helium, they're all at the top. So that's the things that make up living organisms. Over here in the red, that's all the metals. But as I pointed out, things go in columns. The further down a column you go, the more toxic things get. So if you look over here with carbon being one of the main element from which life is made, if you go down to the bottom, you get lead, which is toxic to life. The other interesting thing about the periodic table is as you go down to heavier and heavier elements, things get more radioactive. So down at the very bottom here, you have uranium and plutonium, which you would be familiar with. And this leads us to our next topic of conversation. Over here, at the bottom of this column, is radium. And Siren is going to tell us all about that.
Radium. Very exciting story. Thank you. Was discovered in 1898 by Marie and Pierre Curie. Radioluminescent paint went into mass production in 1914. So it's pretty fast after being discovered, it was put into commercial use. Radium was the glow-in-the-dark element for this new paint. And it was mined throughout the First World War for luminous paint used on aircrafts under contract from the government. Seems very serious and safe, doesn't it? Later, the paint was commercially branded undark, that photo shows the range of instruments that this glow-in-the-dark paint was used for in a really practical way. But naturally, like all things fabulous and scientific, it was very quickly adopted into the domestic realm for fashionable clocks on mantelpieces, also for granddad's slippers, which you can never find. They painted the buckles with radium paint. Handy. And dolls' eyeballs also received a little bit of radium paint, or undark paint as it was called. The US Radium Corporation and other similar companies hired approximately 4,000 workers, all of whom were pretty much unskilled women, and they were used to paint clock dials and the numbers on watch faces. So as you can very easily imagine, the little tiny numbers on watches were a skilled job, and the woman would use tiny, tiny little brushes to paint the radium on the numbers. The radium paint, sorry. And as they went about painting, their brushes, the bristles would slowly spread out, meaning they couldn't accurately paint anymore. So the supervisors trained all the women, it was standard practice, to reshape the end of their little brushes between their lips and just give it a little twist to recreate that tip on the brush. So in this way, the workers consumed orally tiny amounts of undark paint all day, every day. It was tasteless, and radium at the time was being touted as having special health benefits, so nobody questioned the practice. Each worker painted 250 dials a day for 5.5 days a week. Girls, being girls, thought how amusing it would be if they used some of this amazing glow-in-the-dark paint to surprise their boyfriends in the middle of the night. Thus, some workers painted their fingernails, toenails, and teeth with undark paint. But it wasn't just the factory workers who were being crazy and reckless with the paint, because it was sort of common practice to play with radium. This is a postcard that was sent through the Royal Postal Delivery Service, would have been handled by multiple postal workers, and was just really considered a gimmick or a novelty. That's indeed radioactive blob up in the corner. Of course, the factory workers had the most dangerous relationship with radium because they were ingesting it orally, not like on a postcard where you might just touch it with your fingers. To quote Alan Bellows, who wrote a book called Undark and the Radium Girls, by shaping their brushes with their lips as instructed by their knowledgeable supervisors, the dial painters had ingested anywhere from a few hundred to a few thousand microcurries of radium per year. 1/10 of a microcurry is now considered to be the maximum safe exposure. Very scary. The dial painters soon became known as the Radium Girls because they developed similar and myriad health problems. At first, they just seemed listless, poorly and weak, but many developed alarming dental problems. Their teeth literally fell out, and they had excruciating pain in their jaws. But that was just the beginning. Radium attacked the women's skeletons, creating brittle honeycomb-like patterns in their bones, and their jaws literally rotted away, and their hips broke, and their ankles crumbled. When they sneezed, their handkerchiefs glowed in the dark, and they were exhaling radon gas. Their nerve and muscle function deteriorated. Without a doubt, the poisoning of the Radium Girls is a hideous, tragic story, but is also an extraordinary tale of a massive industry cover-up. The US radium industry, who employed these women, hired people to impersonate doctors, examine the women, and declare them perfectly healthy or full of syphilis. 5 very brave Radium Girls, who happened to also be dying, decided they'd take the company to court, suing for $25,000 each. The company employed only the best of lawyers to masterfully delay court proceedings, to the point that when the woman actually took the stand, they did not have the strength to raise their arms for the oath. After a long and horrible battle, the woman settled out of court, each receiving $10,000, and the promise of an additional $600 for each further year of their life. Needless to say, the company didn't have to budget for this extra expenditure. Grim story of poisoning. I should also perhaps add that the chemist at the US Radium Company who foo-fooed the poisoning also died of radium poisoning, as did the discoverer herself, Marie Curie, who died of radium poisoning in 1934. This pitiful story of poisoning is one of the stories that formed the beginning of public awareness for workers' health and safety in the workplace. So in no small way, the Radium Girl story contributed to my fantastic Tyvek suit today. Val?
Thank you. Well, on the radiation theme, let's talk about some uranium. You probably all know uranium as the thing that powers nuclear power plants. However, it has also been used in both glass and ceramics as a colorant. Some of you may recall that bright orange glaze that was popular in the 70s. That was a uranium glaze. Although uranium glasses were more popular in the Depression years of the 1930s. So many of you may have Depression glass, uranium glass, or ceramics in your cupboard at home now, or in your grandmother's cupboard. So while the use of uranium in glasses dates back as far as Roman times, its height of popularity was between the 1880s and the 1930s. And in this picture, you see the glass glowing, the glass is glowing a lovely bright green. That's not the green of the radiation. What it is this glass has been illuminated under black light or ultraviolet light, and under ultraviolet light, the uranium glows this particular shade of green. Now, as I mentioned, the bright orange glazes, in the 1936, the Homer Laughlin China Company came out with this line of dinnerware called Fiesta Ware with the uranium orange glaze on it. And while orange was the most common color that you think of with the uranium glazes, it also came in yellows, greens, browns, and blacks. But in one of these dinner plates, there could be up to 20% uranium in the glaze, which amounted to as much as 5 grams of uranium per plate. And this is the natural purified uranium that you would get from your uranium ores. Now, interestingly, in World War II, because the uranium compounds that the company used to make these glazes could be used to make a nuclear bomb, the United States government confiscated the company's entire stock of the color. And so these went out of production until 1959, when the production of uranium glazes resumed using depleted uranium. So other than the sort of common dinnerware ceramics that you see, you also have other types of glasses and ceramics that you'll find that are uranium glazes and glasses. So you could see it also in this high value fine art vase, or you could see it as a clear glaze on ordinary looking ceramics, or you could find it in children's toys like marbles. So these are uranium glass marbles. Usually they contained up to 2% uranium in them, although in some of the earlier 19th century glasses, they could be as much as 25% uranium. And it's the uranium that gives them this sort of greeny yellow color to them. The sort of more translucent glasses, they came by different names. Vaseline glass is a uranium glass, so-called because it looked like petroleum jelly. Custard glass is another term for the more yellowy uranium glasses. And then depression glass is sometimes used interchangeably for them. But depression glass is a more generic term for the glasses produced in the Depression era and is not used solely for uranium glass. So next we have a little demonstration here. So we have a selection of glasses and glazes. We have a clear glass, which is probably not uranium glass. We have a sort of greenish glass, which may be uranium glass. We have another greenish glass, which could also be uranium glass. And then we have a nice bright orange glaze. And we have a black light. So we can see which one glows under. And in addition to that, we also have a Geiger counter. And we can see if any of them are radioactive. As well as that, we also have some uranium rocks, and we can see what sort of radiation those give off.
All right, first part in dark, very exciting. We're going to start with the ordinary glass. Thank you, Rachel. All right.
How do we turn this off?
Oh well, we'll go with this, shall we?
So anyhow, you can see, you get a bit of reflection off of the black light there, but you don't really see any green glow happening. So the next one, again, you're getting a little bit of, maybe a little bit of green glow, not really a whole lot.
Ah, that's the right reaction. This is my measuring cup from my kitchen.
And then, no glow happening there. But we have one definite hit. And we did do some analysis with X-ray fluorescence. So we found this green glass contained copper but no uranium. So the green is coming from the copper. This one definitely contained uranium. This one was mostly lead, zinc, and barium oxide colorants, but just a tiny hint of uranium. But that could have been impurities in the lead ore. So now we have our Geiger counter here. So does someone want to be our background check? Can we check you for background radiation? Let's see here. Got any little flakes coming off of you? Yeah, we've got a few happening. Not very many. You haven't had any medical tests recently? No. I shouldn't be. Yeah, pacemaker or anything like that? No. No pacemaker? Okay. Okay. All right. Something there. Okay.
So how sensitive is this, Val?
Well, right now we have a number of settings that we can put this on. We can. Oh, I think the problem is we have a loose wire in this. So if I touch the wire, it goes off the end. But anyhow, we can put it on this setting where we get a background radiation level of about 0.1, and that's normal. And if we're testing something that's very radioactive, it'll go off the end of the scale, but we can take the gain down a bit. And so we've got 2 levels of gain that we can take things down.
So shall we test this, which we suspected might have had a uranium glaze?
Just a second here, I'm getting something happening here. Okay. Yeah, maybe over here.
Okay, 1 second. It's just normalizing itself. Here we go.
Yeah. All right. So we're getting our about background level off of that one.
Let's try the uranium glass.
A little tiny bit, not much. Barely detectable above background.
Right. Well, over here, I have
These are our hot rocks.
the source of uranium.
Yes, this is the ore that uranium is made from. But these are just rocks as picked up off the ground.
Can you hear that?
Mm-hmm. I've kind of gone off the end of the scale there.
So is it the click noise that you're looking
Yeah, that's the click noise that we're looking for.
We also have a dial that
Yes,
we can
and
see.
so you can't really see it, but it goes.
And what's this one, Val?
Oh, they're both pitch blend. Oh, yeah. That one's a little still radioactive. Oh.
So just since you can't see, that's on the sensitive, not so sensitive, and not very sensitive at all setting.
Yes.
So we could conclude, keep this away.
But I'd like to point out that this is just rock that someone has gone and chipped out of the ground, just sitting there. You could have been going for your tramp, sat down on that rock, had your lunch, moved on, never known that you were sitting on a radioactive rock. So you can see that compared to a rock that you can find in the ground to this is only slightly radioactive.
Excellent.
Excellent. All right, moving on. I thought I'd move from heavy metals and chemicals that are used to color glasses and ceramics to the colors you get in paint pigments. Well, the colors that you get in ceramics and glass all tend to be heavy metals because they have to undergo a very high temperature firing process, and any sort of organic dye would just be burned up in that process. But a lot of those heavy metal colorants are used in paints as well to produce the colors. Many metal oxides and salts are brightly colored, and it's for this reason that they get used. They're stable and they're brightly colored. You just have to think of the greenish corrosion you get on copper or the orange colors you get from rusty iron. Returning to our periodic table, twice in one day you get the periodic table. I thought I'd point out some of the different colorants that we have. So, have we all heard of vermilion before? Does anyone know what vermilion is? It's a reddish pigment that was used since antiquity to produce the red colors in many paintings, and that is a mercury sulfide. Paris green is another painter's pigment, and that's a mixture of arsenic and copper compounds. Chinese white is a lead white, so down here it's a heavy metal. Lemon yellow is another lead tin pigment. Cobalt blue, very common in the artist's palette for bright blue colors, so that's cobalt metal that's producing the blue. Prussian blue is another shade of blue. You've probably heard of it. It's a darker, more navy blue, but that's a mixture of iron and cyanide. And then chrome green, that's a chromium oxide. It's carcinogenic. And the cadmium reds and yellows. Cadmium over here right next to mercury in the same column, so its toxicity is very similar. But it's replaced, the cadmium reds and yellows have replaced vermilion because you get a much broader range of colors and brighter colors out of it. So this is the pure pigment powders, the cadmium pigments. It's cadmium sulfide and selenide. The differences between the colors is the more selenium you add, the redder the color gets. But also particle size makes a difference, so that will affect the color as well. And this is cinnabar ore. Cinnabar is the traditional ore that vermilion was ground from. It's used a lot in Chinese lacquers. So even today there are festivals. This is a Hindu festival where married women smear their faces with vermilion. But even back in Roman times, Roman soldiers would smear their faces with vermilion to celebrate a victorious general. And here we are with the Chinese lacquer that uses the cinnabar to create the color. And here in the museum collection we do have a number of the red Chinese lacquers. However, some of them have been damaged by water at some time in the past, and so the surface is all quite powdery and crumbly. So that is an issue for us when we have to handle it. We're getting mercury dust basically on our fingers, and if we're not careful about washing our hands when we go away to eat or something, we might ingest it. So that's the end of the PowerPoint part of our talk, but we have a selection of materials that you can come and look at if you want. We have the bright heavy metal powder pigments if you want to come and look at them. We have stinky, toxic conservation chemicals. If you're brave, you can take a sniff. And then we have all our protective equipment you can try out here. We've got our Geiger counter you can take a look at. And we have a mercury spill kit for cleaning up mercury spills.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Pretty much inviting us to come touch poisons.
Yes, if you want, and snort poisons if you want. Oh,
We have spear gloves.
we also have the mercury, the 13 times denser than water. You can give it a lift to get a feel for what that feels like.